You're listening to the Dibbly-Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page as well. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Dibbly-Dobbly Podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, we review the 4th T20 International between New Zealand and Australia and preview the 5th T20 International from the Wellington Regional Stadium. It's the Dibbly-Dobbly Podcast, and let's get started. Let's recap the scores from the 4th T20 International between New Zealand and Australia. Australia batted first and made 6 for 156 from their 20 overs. Aaron Finch backing up with back-to-back 50s, top scoring with 79 not out from 55 balls. Sodhi was the star bowler for New Zealand, taking 3 for 32 from his 4 overs. New Zealand in reply, all out for 106 from 18.5 overs. Kyle Jamieson top scored with 30 off 18 balls, and Kane Richardson was the star bowler for Australia, taking 3 for 19 from 2.5 overs. Australia won by 50 runs, levelled the series at 2-all to take it to a deciding match. Aaron Finch was the man of the match for his 79 not out. What were some of the key factors to deciding this match between New Zealand and Australia? Aaron Finch's innings of 79 not out was key to Australia getting to 156. At one stage it looked like they weren't going to get that score because New Zealand were bowling well and taking wickets at regular intervals during the Australian innings. But the last over of the Australian innings, bowled by Kyle Jamieson, cost New Zealand this match. Finch smashed 20 runs off the last over to get Australia to 156, which proved to be a winning score, which led to Australia levelling the series at 2-all and taking it to a deciding match. Let's have a look at how New Zealand performed in this 4th T20 International. We'll start with their batsmen. Guptill 7, Seifert 19, Williamson 8, Conway 17, Phillips 1, Neesham 3. Let's have a look at their bowlers. Sodhi took 3 wickets, Bolt took 2 wickets, a wicket to Mitch Satner, no wickets to Southey and Jamieson. That's how New Zealand performed as a team in this 4th T20 International. Overall, a disappointing result for New Zealand. They lost this game by 50 runs. They lost game 3 by 64 runs. So 2 crushing defeats for New Zealand. They've gone backwards, New Zealand. Early in this series, they were favourites to win this series 5-0 after leading 2-0 after the first 2 games in Christchurch and Dunedin. Unfortunately, in these last 2 games, they've just sort of gone backwards. They haven't really performing at their best, really. Australia have done well to come back to level the series at 2-all and take it to a deciding match in Wellington for the 5th T20 of this series. What can you say that has contributed to New Zealand's form slump in this series? Is it because there were no crowds in Wellington for these last 2 games? I think that has something to do with it because the crowd adds that extra atmosphere. We saw that in the first 2 games where there were packed houses in Christchurch and Dunedin. Unfortunately, with the current situation in New Zealand, there are no crowds there at the moment. I think that has to do with New Zealand losing these 2 games. But in saying that, I don't think that's the full contributing factor to New Zealand losing these 2 games. I think at the end of the day, they just didn't execute their skills, really. In this game, they didn't execute their skills with the bat. They were poor. The last game, the execution with the ball let them down. And in this game, they had a better bowling performance in this game. Mitchell Satner returned to the side, which adds that extra bowling option for Kane Williamson. So he didn't have to use Neesham in this game as he did in the last game because New Zealand didn't have Satner, whereas in this game they did have Satner. So Williamson didn't have to use Neesham as another bowling option. And they bowled quite well, New Zealand. At one stage, New Zealand, they looked like they were going to restrict Australia to around about 140, 130, up until the last over bowled by Kyle Jamieson to Aaron Finch, which went for 20 runs. And I think that cost New Zealand this game, really. If Aaron Finch didn't get 20 runs off that last over, New Zealand would have been chasing a lot less than 156. But Jamieson, throughout this whole series, he's really struggled with the ball. He's just really struggled. He's just going for runs, leaking runs. The last over he bowled to Finch, he bowled half volleys That's not the deliveries you want to bowl to Aaron Finch when he's in a hitting mode, really. And he's looking to tee off, which he did. And the last server went for 20. You can't bowl half volleys. You got to do better than that. You got to bowl some Yorkers in there. Get it into the block hole because batsmen can't get underneath the Yorker. Yes, the risk with the Yorker is that you do bowl a low full toss, but you got to back yourself to execute the Yorker, especially at the death and especially in the last over of the innings. Unfortunately for Jamieson, he didn't do that. And unfortunately, he went for 20 runs in the over. That probably was the difference in New Zealand winning and losing this game. If they had a good last over, they would have chased a lot less. But they didn't. It went for 20. Aaron Finch got Australia to 156, and probably that cost New Zealand the game because the surface was a really hard surface to get going on as a batsman. It looked a bit slow. There was a bit of turn there for the spinners, so it was difficult for both teams with the bat to really get something out of this surface with the bat, really. The bowlers bowled from both teams. They bowled well on it. Australia bowled extremely well on the surface, whereas New Zealand did up front up until the last over from Jamieson. So for New Zealand, that was disappointing for them to leak 20 runs off the last over, heading into their batting innings. So their bowling was improved from the last game, but up until Jamieson's over, it really went downhill for New Zealand since then, really. And that sort of really carried on into their batting innings because they didn't really get going at all. I don't think the batsmen adapted to the conditions. They didn't read the conditions well. They struggled. Australia bowled well. New Zealand were losing wickets at regular intervals. They didn't have a great power play. They didn't back up their partnerships. Their partnerships throughout this batting innings were 21, 13, 2, 5, 7, 9, 7, 16, 2, and 24. Now, those are not great, obviously, so they didn't really back up the partnerships in this innings. They lost wickets. The required run rate was climbing, and they couldn't keep up with the rate. Dot balls were building as well. Wickets were falling. And unfortunately, they got bowled out for 106. So not the greatest display of batting from New Zealand. They've got very good batsmen in their side who are match winners on their day. But today, in this game, they just couldn't do it. And it was a disappointing performance from them. And I think looking back in this game, I think all of them will be disappointed about how they got out and how they performed. And they didn't really quite read the conditions. So for New Zealand with the bat, overall disappointing performance from them, really. So in saying that, New Zealand have got a lot of work to do heading into this last game because in the last two games they've chased and they haven't done a really good job in chasing down the total set by Australia. It was over 208 in Game 3. In Game 4, it's 156. And the last game, they got bowled out for 144. This game, 106. So there's a lot of areas to improve on for New Zealand in terms of the batting because in the last two games, they've had scoreboard pressure and they've lost wickets. And in T20 cricket, when you lose wickets in a run chase and you have the scoreboard pressure, it's always going to be hard to chase down the runs. And unfortunately for New Zealand, that's what's happened in these last two games. So for New Zealand, they need to turn things around quickly because in this last game, Australia are going to be very hard to beat in this deciding game of the series. All the momentum is with Australia. So for New Zealand, it's hard to take that momentum off Australia now because they've won the last two games. They know Australia. They win this game. They win the series. New Zealand know it's going to be hard work to win this last game. So I think New Zealand, they just need to back themselves and hopefully play their best game in this last game. And then they'll win the series. But if they don't, unfortunately, it will be a series loss. After leading 2-0 in the series, to go on to lose the series 3-2, it's not going to be a great result for New Zealand. So New Zealand really have to turn it around to try and bounce back and win this series. But overall, poor performance again from New Zealand. They've got very high standards of themselves. They'll be looking back at this match saying that we just didn't execute our skills again. like the last game. Just didn't execute. So they've got to be better in this last game. And if they do that, they're a good side. They can bounce back. If they do that, then they're a chance of winning. But at the moment, the momentum's with Australia, and it's going to be very hard to beat them in this last game of the series. Let's have a look at how Australia performed in this fourth T20 International. We'll start with their batsmen. Wade, 14. Finch, 79 not out. Philippi, 13. Maxwell, 18. Stoinis, 19. Ashanaga, 0. And Mitchell Marsh, 6. Let's have a look at the bowlers. Kane Richardson took 3 wickets. Zampa, Agar, and Maxwell took 2 wickets each. No wickets to Jai Richardson and Meredith. That's how Australia performed as a team in this fourth T20 International. A very good win by Australia again to bounce back and to level the series at 2-2. They won this game by 50 runs. They won the last game by 64 runs. So very convincing victories there from Australia to bounce back and to take this series to a deciding match for the 5th T20 in Wellington. Australia's performance overall in this match was a very good performance, as I said before. We'll start with their bowling performance, because I thought Australia's bowling performance in this game was probably their best in the whole series. The first 2 games, the bowling unit struggled in the series and weren't at their best, not quite executing their skills. Whereas in this game and in the last game, the bowlers started to execute their skills a lot better. They bowled well, they bowled to their plans, they bowled to their fields. Their line and length has been good and consistent. So overall, the bowlers have been doing a good job in these last 2 games for Australia. So they've definitely turned things around. Obviously, in this bowling performance in this game, they didn't allow New Zealand to get off to a flyer. They took early wickets up front in the power play. And whenever you're defending a total of 150 odd on a pitch, that's a little bit difficult, but it's still manageable to chase down 150. You've got to have a very good start with the ball. You've got to start well. You've got to take wickets early. And that's what the Australian bowlers did. They took wickets early in the power play. That restricted New Zealand. And unfortunately for New Zealand, just went downhill from there. Australia kept taking wickets at regular intervals. Therefore, the required run rate was climbing, getting out of control for New Zealand. Dot balls were building as well. Scoreboard pressure, which led to the dismissals from the New Zealand batsmen. And the bowlers just executed their plans and did well to defend 156. And for Australia, they're starting to get things together now. They found their mojo, the team's playing well, and the bowlers are doing their part as well as the batsmen. So for Australia's bowlers in this match, once again, a very good job. Finchy couldn't be happier about the bowlers doing their job, defending the runs well, and as I said before, just executing their skills, which has been lacking from Australia in the first 2 games. Whereas in this game and in the last game, they've executed their skills superbly. So a big tick there for Australia in terms of their bowling in this match. It's probably one of their best, as I said before, in this series. So positive signs to come for the last game in the decider in the 5th T20 back here in Wellington. The fielding was good again. They caught everything again. Australia, the ground fielding was good in the field today in this game. So very good from Australia. Their batting was good. It was okay. They lost wickets at regular intervals, Australia, but New Zealand were bowling well. And for Australia, they just couldn't get going on this surface. I don't think both teams got going on the surface because it was a really hard surface to get started on. But the one shining light for Australia in this innings was Aaron Finch. If he didn't get 79 in the end, it would have been a lot different for Australia. They would have been setting New Zealand around about 140, 130, maybe even 120 to win. But Aaron Finch, he saw wickets tumble at the other end. He said, right, I've got to bat through the innings. I've got to get us to a score that we can defend on this pitch. And in the end, he got 79 not out. And the last over to Kyle Jamieson, as I said before, was the critical over in this match. If Jamieson bowled a good over, New Zealand would have been chasing probably 140, maybe even 130. In the end, Aaron Finch, he hit him for 20 runs off the over. and which really cost New Zealand this game, and which really set up Australia this victory, really. Because Aaron Finch, that over went for 20 off Jamieson. He got Australia to 156. Australia were able to bowl well, execute their skills, and bowl New Zealand out for 106 to win by 50 runs. So in the end, it was a very good score on this difficult surface. Aaron Finch being talked about in the media, obviously. He's been copping it because he's been out of form. People saying he should be dropped. He should be dropped as captain as well. But Finchy has definitely come back in these last two games. He's definitely back in form. And as I said in the last review we did, Aaron Finch, he plays well when he's in a positive mindset. In this game, he was in a positive mindset again. He was looking to attack, put the pressure back on the New Zealand bowlers, which he did at times. And he really supported the Australian innings well to get Australia to 156. As I said before, without Aaron Finch, without his innings of 79 not out, and without that last over that went for 20 runs off Jamieson, Australia could have set New Zealand a lot lower than 156. Could have been 140, maybe 130, maybe even 120 at one stage. Because New Zealand were bowling well. But he came in, got Australia to 156, and that was enough for Australia to win the game. So for Australia, positive signs heading into the last game. In this game, they couldn't back up the partnerships in terms of the batting, obviously, with the partnerships. The partnerships in this game were 18, 24, 26, 25, 4, 17 and 42 unbeaten with Finch and Jai Richardson at the end there. They just really couldn't back up the partnerships like they did in Game 3. So for Australia, that's something to look at for the next game in the decider, is to back up partnerships. Make it a big partnership after you've lost a wicket. They did that well in Game 3. Unfortunately, in Game 4, they didn't quite do that as well. But obviously, they'll tighten that up headed into the last game in the decider. But overall, a very good performance from Australia once again. Good to see them fight back. Would have been easy for Australia just to give up. But in cricket, you can't do that. You can't just throw in the towel and say, right, we're going to give up here because we're 2-0 down. And it's very hard to win 3 games on the trot to win a 5-game series. You can't think like that. You've got to be positive. You've got to be brave. You've got to take risk. And for Australia, things are starting to come together for them. The last 2 games, they're starting to play good T20 cricket. And we all know that Australia can play like this. They didn't show that in the first 2 games, but in these last 2 games, they've definitely shown why Australia are a very good T20 side. They've got a lot of match winners: Finch, Maxwell, Stoinis, Dashenagar, Mitchell Marsh, Matthew Wade even. So Australia, very positive signs headed into the last game. And for them, an opportunity to win the series after coming back from 2-0 down. And I think at the moment, Australia have the momentum. All the momentum is with Australia. And it's going to be very hard for New Zealand to wrestle the momentum back. Because Australia have won the last 2 games in a row quite convincingly. 50 runs in this 4th game, 64 in the 3rd game. So the momentum is definitely with Australia. It's going to be hard work for New Zealand to wrestle that momentum back. But Australia, for me, are going to be very hard to beat in this last game. It's going to be very hard work for New Zealand. So I think Australia, they'll be slightly confident of winning this last game and winning the series 3-2 after coming back from a 2-0 deficit. So that's going to be a very proud achievement for this team. Doing it without the star players as well, like Warner, Smith, Cummins and Stark. Doing it without those players will be a very good achievement for these players in this squad, to do it without the main players. So for Australia, as I said before, they've got the momentum. They'll be confident heading into this last game that they can win it and come back to win the series 3-2 after being 2-0 down early on in the series. It will be a proud achievement. If they do it, I think they can, and it's going to be very hard work for New Zealand. Let's talk about both teams' potential 11s heading into the 5th T20 International. New Zealand may make some changes to their team for the final T20 after losing the 2 previous games in this series. Kyle Jamieson has really struggled throughout the series with the ball, so he could miss out, and maybe Hamish Bennett could come in to replace him. Another change they could make, maybe take Jimmy Neesham out for Mark Chapman to strengthen the batting. Hopefully those changes could bring about a different result for New Zealand in this final T20 of the series. So the likely 11 could be Guptill, Seifert, Williamson, Conway, Phillips, Neesham or Chapman, Satner, Southey, Bennett, Sodhi and Bolt. Australia may keep the same 11 for the final T20 after winning these last two matches with this 11. They may try some players out for this deciding game to give other players a go like Ben McDermott, Jason Behrendorff and Andrew Tye. But I don't think they will do that with the series on the line after doing so well to bounce back in this series. As they say in cricket, don't change a winning team, so the likely 11 could be Finch, Wade, Philippi, Maxwell, Stoinis, Mitchell Marsh, Ashton Agar, Jai Richardson, Kane Richardson, Sampa and Meredith. Both teams may go with those 11s for the 5th T20 International, but we shall see. It's going to be an exciting finish to this series, locked at 2-2 and heading into a decider. New Zealand were shaping up to win this series after a dominant first two games, but seemed to lose their way in these last two games. Australia have bounced back well, winning these last two games to take the series to a decider. Australia have the momentum after these two convincing wins and are the favourites in this deciding match. It will be hard for New Zealand to bounce back, but New Zealand will give it a red-hot crack. It's going to be an exciting deciding match of this T20 series, but I think Australia will win the series. But let's hope we get a good game of T20 cricket to end the series. Well, that's the end of the innings to close the play for this episode of the podcast. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get the latest episodes of the podcast. And like and share our Facebook page. Until next time, keep safe and bye for now.